Monument Valley, Utah, October 15, 1968. Producer Harvey Lembeck had been running his mouth for 3 days straight, calling Charles Bronson yesterday's cowboy in front of Sergio Leone's entire crew. That's exactly why nobody saw the explosion coming. Bronson had been sitting quietly by the catering truck, methodically eating his sandwich. Lembeck strutted over with his entourage, loud and confident. He pointed at the 52-year-old actor and declared to everyone within earshot, "This is what's wrong with Westerns. Guys like Charlie here, still acting like it's 1935. What happened in the next 30 seconds changed everything. Not just for Bronson, not just for the movie, for the entire Western genre." Lembeck hit the ground. The cameras kept rolling, and somewhere in that desert dust, a legend was born. The day a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania reminded Hollywood what real fire looked like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hadn't even settled when Sergio Leone's voice cut through the shocked silence like a blade through canvas. "Basta! Enough!" The Italian director's eyes blazed with something between fury and fascination as he surveyed the scene. Harvey Lembeck sprawled in the red dirt, his pressed khakis now the color of dried blood, his perfectly styled hair catching tumbleweeds. The producer's entourage, 3 studio executives in ridiculous safari jackets, stood frozen like deer in headlights. But it was Charles Bronson who commanded the moment. The actor stood perfectly still, his weathered hands hanging loose at his sides, no trace of the violence that had just erupted visible in his posture. Only his eyes betrayed what had happened. They burned with an ancient fire that seemed to reach back through generations of hard men who'd carved their names into unforgiving stone. "Charlie," Lembeck wheezed from the ground, tasting copper and humiliation. "You crazy son of a—" "Shut up, Harvey." Leone's assistant director, Mickey O'Brien, stepped forward, his Irish accent thick with warning. "Just shut the hell up." The film crew, grips, gaffers, script supervisors, makeup artists, formed a loose circle around the confrontation. Most had worked enough sets to know when to stay quiet and when to run. This felt like both moments at once. Bronson reached into his shirt pocket with deliberate slowness and pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes. His fingers, scarred from childhood years hauling coal carts in Pennsylvania mines, didn't shake as he lit one. The flame from his Zippo illuminated eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. 20 years, Bronson said finally, his voice carrying the gravel of underground tunnels and late-night fights in working-class bars. 20 years I've been taking your garbage parts, playing the heavy, the psycho, the guy who gets shot in the second act. He took a long drag, letting smoke drift across the ancient landscape. Never complained, never caused trouble, just did the work. Lembeck struggled to his feet, his studio executives rushing to brush dust from his clothes like anxious valets. "This is assault, Bronson. I'll have you blacklisted from every—" "Will you?" Bronson's laugh held no humor. "With what? You gonna tell people I hit you because you called me old? Because you said I couldn't act?" He gestured toward the towering red mesas surrounding them. "Look around, Harvey. This is Monument Valley, John Ford's cathedral, where real Westerns were born. And you want to lecture me about what's wrong with the genre?" The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something older, the ghosts of cavalry charges and cattle drives, of desperate men making desperate choices under an endless sky. Leone had been filming Westerns in Spain for years, but this moment felt different, more authentic. The Italian director sensed something profound happening, something that couldn't be scripted or manufactured. His instincts, honed through countless hours of studying American mythology, told him to keep watching. "You think this is about acting?" Bronson continued, addressing not just Lembeck but the entire assembled crew. "You think what you saw in those early pictures, House of Wax, Drumbeat, Machine Gun Kelly, you think that was me pretending to be dangerous?" O'Brien found himself holding his breath. In 30 years of making movies, he'd never heard an actor speak with such quiet intensity. It was like watching a man confess to crimes nobody knew had been committed. "I grew up in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania," Bronson said. "Population 1,200 on a good day. My father died in the mines when I was 10. Left my mother with 15 kids and nothing but debt. You know what you do in a place like that? You fight. For food, for work, for the right to wake up tomorrow and do it all again. He flicked his cigarette into the dust where it smoldered like a fallen star. Every character I've played, every villain, every psychopath, they're all me, Harvey. Just different versions of what a man becomes when the world tries to bury him alive. Bronson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the desert silence, every word carried. The only difference is, in the movies, I die at the end. In real life, I'm still here. Leone made a decision that would change cinema history. Instead of shutting down production, instead of calling security or studio heads or lawyers, he turned to his cinematographer. "Tonino," he said quietly, "set up the cameras again. Different angle this time. Sergio, what are you? We're going to capture this. All of it. Whatever happens next." Leone's eyes never left Bronson's face. This isn't just an actor having a breakdown. This is America, bleeding through the cracks. As the crew scrambled to reposition equipment, Bronson stood motionless in the fading afternoon light, a man-shaped piece of the landscape itself, weathered, enduring, and absolutely unbreakable. The real performance was just beginning. The cameras rolled in silence, their mechanical whisper the only sound breaking the desert's cathedral hush. Bronson felt the lens like a confession booth, waiting, patient, hungry for truth. He'd been photographed thousands of times before, but this moment carried different weight. This wasn't about hitting his mark or remembering lines. This was about excavation. "Tell them about Ehrenfeld." Leone's voice came soft as prayer. The Italian director understood something the Hollywood machine never grasped. That real stories lived in the spaces between words, in the pauses where men decided whether to reveal themselves or retreat into comfortable lies. Bronson's weathered face caught the last amber light of day. Monument Valley's ancient monuments stood witness as he reached back through 42 years of carefully buried memories. "My real name's Charles Dennis Buczynski," he began, his voice carrying the rhythm of coal cars and steam whistles. Nobody in Hollywood wanted a name that sounded too polished, too foreign, too much like the kind of people who died underground for other men's comfort. The crew had gone utterly still. Even Harvey Lembeck, still nursing his bruised ego and dusty clothes, found himself leaning forward. There was something magnetic about watching a man strip away decades of professional armor. We lived in a company house, 12 rooms for 17 people, and half those rooms weren't big enough to turn around in. Bronson's eyes focused on something beyond the cameras, beyond the desert, beyond time itself. "My mother, Mary, she spoke better Lithuanian than English, prayed in Polish, cried in whatever language hurt least." He pulled out another lucky strike but didn't light it, just held it between scarred fingers like a talisman. "When my father went down in that mine shaft for the last time, cave in on Sector 7, they said, I remember standing at his funeral thinking I was the man of the house now, 10 years old and responsible for keeping everybody alive." A bitter smile flickered across his features. "You know what the mining company gave us for my father's life? $63 and a notice to vacate company housing." Leone made a subtle gesture to his cinematographer. "Tighter shot. Capture the geography of this man's face. Every line a story, every scar a battle fought in America's forgotten places." So I went to work, sold newspapers at 5 in the morning before school, swept floors at Murphy's bar after. Weekends I'd go down to the rail yard and load freight cars for whatever they'd pay. Bronson's voice never rose, but something in its undertone suggested violence held in careful check. 15, 16 hours a day. Hands bleeding, back breaking, but we ate. Barely, but we ate. The wind shifted, carrying with it the day's accumulated heat and the promise of a cold desert night. Someone in the crew coughed, probably a chain smoker from New York who'd never missed a meal in his life, and Bronson's gaze flicked toward the sound with predatory awareness. "See, that's what you Hollywood people never understand," he continued, his attention returning to the camera's unblinking eye. "You think survival is something you act, something you research in books or method acting classes. But for some of us, it's just Tuesday." Harvey Lembeck shifted uncomfortably. The producer was beginning to realize he'd picked a fight with something far more dangerous than an aging character actor. This was elemental, raw human experience that couldn't be manufactured in studio system laboratories. "I remember the first time I killed a man," Bronson said with the same casual tone others might use to discuss the weather. "Not in a movie, real life. I was 17, working a job site in Pittsburgh. 3 guys jumped me for my week's pay. Figured some dumb Polack kid would be easy money. The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Even Leone, who directed his share of violent films, felt something cold walk up his spine. I didn't plan it, didn't want it. But when you grow up with nothing, you learn that some things are worth dying for. Your dignity, your family's next meal, the right to walk down a street without predators thinking you're prey." Bronson finally lit his cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating eyes that had seen the bottom of human experience, and climbed back up. "Turned out I was worth killing for those things, too." Mickey O'Brien found his hands trembling slightly. 30 years of film sets, countless tough guys and method actors, but he'd never heard a man speak about violence with such matter-of-fact acceptance. This wasn't braggadocio or intimidation. This was confession. "So when I play these parts, the killers, the psychopaths, the men who live outside society's rules, I'm not reaching for some dramatic truth," Bronson continued. "I'm just remembering what it feels like to be cornered, what it costs to survive when the world decides you don't matter." The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert the color of dried blood. In that dying light, Charles Bronson looked less like an actor and more like an ancient force of nature, something carved from the same unforgiving stone that surrounded them. "The difference is," he said quietly, "most men break. I just got harder." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a gun barrel. Bronson took a final drag from his lucky strike and flicked it into the dust, where it joined the bones of 10,000 stories buried in Monument Valley's unforgiving soil. That's when they heard the car. The sound came from the east, cutting through the evening silence, a rental sedan's engine straining against the grade, tires spitting gravel as it climbed the access road to the film location. Leone's eyes narrowed. No one was expected. The last supply truck had come and gone hours ago, and they were 40 miles from the nearest town. Mickey O'Brien shaded his eyes against the dying light. Could be studio people. Maybe Paramount sent... Bronson's voice carried an edge that made everyone turn. The actor's entire posture had changed, his shoulders tensing like a man preparing for impact. Something in his face suggested recognition and fear. The sedan crested the ridge, its headlights sweeping across the assembled crew like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners. It pulled to a stop 20 yards away, engine ticking as it cooled. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 50, wearing a simple blue dress that had seen better decades, and carrying a battered leather purse like a weapon. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back severely, and her face bore the particular hardness that came from surviving things that should have broken her. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, dark, unforgiving, and fixed on Charles Bronson with the intensity of a debt collector. "Hello, Charlie." Her voice carried the faint trace of an Eastern European accent, words shaped by a tongue that had learned English as a second language and never quite forgotten its roots. Bronson went absolutely still. The cigarette pack in his hand crumpled as his fingers tightened involuntarily. For the first time since Harvey Lembeck had hit the dirt, the hardened actor looked genuinely shaken. "Anna," he said, the name emerging like a confession. "What are you doing here?" The woman, Anna, walked closer with measured steps, her practical shoes crunching on the desert floor. The film crew sensed something profound happening and collectively held its breath. "I read about you in the newspapers," she said. "Saw your name, your picture. Charles Bronson, they called you. Big movie star." Her laugh held no warmth, but I recognized those eyes. Same eyes that looked down at me 31 years ago and promised things that turned out to be lies. Leone found himself transfixed. His director's instincts screamed at him to keep filming, but something deeper, call it human decency, made him gesture for the cameras to stop rolling. This felt too raw, too personal for public consumption. Harvey Lembeck, still nursing his wounded pride, started to speak. "Listen, lady, We're in the middle of... Anna's gaze shifted to him with surgical precision. You shut your mouth. This doesn't concern you. Her attention returned to Bronson. But it concerns him, doesn't it, Charlie? Or do you prefer Charles now? Charles Bronson, the big tough guy who kills people in movies? Bronson's hands trembled almost imperceptibly. Anna, I can explain... Explain? Her voice rose for the first time, carrying across the desert like a war cry. Explain what? How you left Pittsburgh one night without a word. How you left me waiting for 3 months before I finally understood you weren't coming back. She opened her purse and pulled out a yellowed envelope, its edges soft with age and handling. Or maybe you want to explain this? She held up the letter, and even from a distance, Mickey O'Brien could see Bronson's name written in faded ink across the front. The actor's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. I wrote you 17 letters, Anna continued, her voice now deadly quiet. 17 letters telling you about your son, about how he looked like you, about how he asked where his daddy was. Her fingers tightened on the envelope, about how he died. The words hit Bronson like physical blows. His knees actually buckled slightly, and he had to step back to maintain balance. The man who had just confessed to killing someone with matter-of-fact calm now looked like he might shatter. Anna, I never knew. You never knew because you never looked back. She advanced another step, and suddenly the 50-year-old woman in the simple dress looked more dangerous than any character Bronson had ever played. You ran away to Hollywood to become somebody else, left Charles Buczynski buried in Pennsylvania with all his responsibilities. The desert wind picked up, stirring dust devils between the monuments. In the gathering darkness, ancient and modern grief merged into something primal. Bronson reached toward her with one scarred hand, then let it fall. What was his name? He whispered. Anna's smile could have cut glass. Michael Charles Buczynski. He would have been 30 this year. In that moment, watching Charles Bronson's carefully constructed armor finally crack, everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would change everything. The man who had just proclaimed himself unbreakable was breaking apart, one buried truth at a time. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Bronson stood frozen in the gathering darkness, Anna's words echoing off the stone monuments like gunshots in a cathedral. Around them, the film crew exchanged glances, some confused, others beginning to understand they'd stumbled into something far beyond a Hollywood production dispute. Michael, Bronson repeated, the name foreign on his tongue. His voice cracked like an adolescent's. I never, Anna, you have to believe me, I never got your letters. Anna's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Of course you didn't, because Charles Buczynski died the day you left Pittsburgh. Isn't that right? You buried him so deep that even his son's death couldn't reach him. Harvey Lembeck shifted nervously, suddenly eager to be anywhere else. The producer who'd been so confident mocking Bronson's primitive acting now found himself witnessing something genuinely primitive, the kind of raw human pain that made grown men look away. Maybe we should... Mickey O'Brien started, but Leone silenced him with a gesture. The Italian director's artistic instincts warred with his conscience. This wasn't performance anymore. This was archaeology, someone digging up bones that should have stayed buried. Bronson took a stumbling step toward Anna, then stopped as if hitting an invisible wall. How did he die? The question hung in the air like smoke. Anna studied his face in the dying light, searching for something, guilt perhaps, or the flicker of the man she'd once known. Pneumonia, she said finally. He was 6 years old, weak lungs like his grandfather. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He kept asking for his daddy right up until the end. I told him you were coming home. I kept telling him that lie because it was easier than explaining that his father had decided being Charles Bronson was more important than being Charles Buczynski. Several crew members began backing away, instinctively understanding they were witnessing something too intimate for strangers. But Bronson seemed oblivious to their presence now. His entire world contracted to this small circle of desert floor where his past had finally caught up with him. I didn't know, he repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Anna, if I had known... You would have what? Come home? Given up your dreams? She shook her head. No, Charlie. You made your choice the night you disappeared. You chose to become someone else. Someone without a past, without responsibilities. Someone who could kill men in movies instead of facing the fact that you killed your own son through neglect. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Bronson actually staggered, his carefully maintained composure crumbling. The man who'd just confessed to real violence with cold precision now looked utterly defenseless. That's not, I didn't what? Didn't abandon us? Didn't leave me alone with a sick child and no money for doctors? Anna's voice rose again, carrying across the desert. I worked 3 jobs, Charlie. Cleaned offices at night, took in washing, scrubbed floors until my hands bled. All while you were out here playing make-believe. Harvey Lembeck found his voice again, though it came out smaller than intended. Listen, this is all very touching, but we have a schedule. Anna turned on him with frightening intensity. Schedule? You want to talk about schedules? She pulled another letter from her purse, this one more recent. I've been tracking Charles Bronson for 15 years. Every movie, every magazine article, every photograph. Waiting for the right moment. The crew began exchanging increasingly nervous glances. This wasn't grief anymore. This was something colder, more calculated. Mickey O'Brien found himself wondering if they should call the police, though the nearest law enforcement was hours away. Bronson seemed to sense the shift, too. His survival instincts, honed through decades of genuine violence, began reasserting themselves. Anna, what do you want? Her smile returned, sharp as a blade. Want? I want my son back. I want those 30 years of wondering if I could have saved him. I want the nights I spent crying myself to sleep while you were becoming famous for playing killers. She stepped closer, and despite being half his size, seemed suddenly more dangerous than the man who'd just flattened a Hollywood producer. But since I can't have any of that, I'll settle for watching Charles Bronson learn what it feels like to lose everything. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something darker, the smell of secrets being unearthed, of carefully constructed lives beginning to collapse. In the growing darkness, Monument Valley's ancient stones looked less like scenic backdrops and more like tombstones marking the death of illusions. Leone watched Bronson's face in the fading light, recognizing something he'd seen in war photographs, the look of a man realizing the ground beneath his feet was already gone, that he'd been falling all along without knowing it. The real performance indeed was just beginning. But this time, Charles Bronson wasn't playing the killer. He was the target. The desert air grew colder as darkness settled over Monument Valley like a burial shroud. Anna reached into her purse again, this time withdrawing a manila folder thick with yellowed papers. She held it against her chest like armor. I brought everything, she said quietly. Medical records, death certificate, the receipt from the funeral home, $18, Charlie. That's what it cost to bury your son. Her fingers traced the folder's edge. I paid for it by selling my mother's wedding ring. Bronson's face contorted as if each word was a physical blow. The tough guy facade he'd spent decades perfecting crumbled like sand. Anna, please. Please what? Please forgive you. Please pretend it doesn't matter. She opened the folder and pulled out a small black and white photograph. Even in the dying light, everyone could see it showed a thin boy with Bronson's unmistakable eyes. He drew pictures of you, Charlie. Drew them right up until his hands got too weak to hold a pencil. Want to see those too? Harvey Lembeck had gone pale, finally understanding he'd triggered something far beyond his comprehension. The producer who'd mocked Bronson's primitive acting now watched genuine primitiveness, the raw, ancient pain of a parent confronting abandonment and loss. I came here to watch you suffer, Anna continued, her voice gaining strength. But looking at you now, I realize something. She studied Bronson's anguished face with clinical detachment. You're not suffering enough. You feel guilty, sure. But guilt is easy. Guilt lets you still be the victim. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a small grave marker in what looked like a potter's field. The headstone was simple, almost crude. Michael Charles Buczynski, 1938 to 1944, beloved son. You want to know the real joke? Anna's laugh held no humor. He defended you. Even at the end, burning up with fever, he defended his daddy. Said you must be doing something important, something that mattered more than coming home. She tucked the photographs back into the folder. A 6-year-old boy, dying alone, making excuses for the man who abandoned him. Mickey O'Brien felt sick. 30 years in Hollywood had shown him every kind of human weakness, but this felt different, older, deeper. This was biblical in its scope, generations of pain condensed into a single moment of reckoning. Bronson tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound. His hands shook as he reached for his cigarettes, then stopped, as if even that simple comfort was now forbidden. "But here's what I really came to tell you," Anna said, moving close enough that Bronson could smell her perfume. The same cheap drugstore scent she'd worn 30 years ago. Michael wasn't the only one who died. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Leone found himself holding his breath, recognizing the rhythm of tragedy from the opera houses of his youth. This was the moment when the hero realizes his fatal flaw has destroyed everything he might have loved. "I was pregnant again when you left," Anna whispered. 3 months along. I lost the baby 2 weeks after Michael died. Stress, the doctor said. Grief. Her smile was terrible in its gentleness. "So you didn't just kill one child through your selfishness, Charlie. You killed 2. Bronson made a sound like a wounded animal. His knees buckled completely this time, and he would have fallen if not for catching himself against a nearby camera. The man who just boasted about surviving violence, about becoming harder instead of breaking, was shattering like glass. "I named her Mary," Anna continued remorselessly, "after your mother. The mother you also abandoned when you decided Charles Buczynski wasn't good enough for Hollywood." She pulled out a final document, another death certificate. She would have been 29 this year, maybe married, maybe given you grandchildren you'll never meet. The wind howled between the monuments, carrying dust and the weight of 30 years' worth of buried secrets. In the growing darkness, the film crew looked like mourners at a funeral, witnesses to the death of illusions they'd never known existed. Harvey Lembeck backed away slowly, finally understanding that his casual cruelty had unleashed something ancient and unstoppable. He'd mocked a man's acting, never realizing that the performance was the only thing keeping deeper horrors at bay. "So here's what happens now," Anna said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd spent decades planning this moment. "I'm going to destroy Charles Bronson, the same way Charles Bronson destroyed Charles Buczynski. Piece by piece, movie by movie. I'm going to tell every reporter, every magazine, every gossip columnist exactly who you really are." She leaned close enough that her breath touched his ear. "And when I'm done, when your career is nothing but ashes, when no one will hire you to play so much as a corpse in a Western, then maybe, you'll understand what it feels like to watch everything you love die while you stand helpless." In the deepening night, Charles Bronson finally learned what it meant to be truly afraid. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before, not the pregnant pause of drama, but the hollow quiet of a tomb. Anna stepped back, watching her words settle into Bronson like poison into bloodstream. The desert wind carried the distant sound of coyotes, their howls echoing off the monuments like laughter from the underworld. But then something unexpected happened. Charles Bronson began to laugh. It started as a low rumble in his chest, barely audible over the wind. Anna's triumphant expression faltered as the sound grew stronger, more bitter. This wasn't the broken sob she'd expected, nor the pleading denial. This was something else entirely. The laughter of a man who just recognized the punchline to a 30-year joke. "Jesus Christ," Bronson said, straightening up slowly, his voice thick with something between grief and amusement. "Jesus fucking Christ, Anna. You really don't know, do you?" The crew exchanged glances. Mickey O'Brien felt the hair on his neck rise. There was something in Bronson's tone that suggested another shoe was about to drop, and this one might crush everything beneath it. Anna's confidence wavered for the first time. "Don't know what?" Bronson wiped his eyes, though whether from tears or laughter was impossible to tell in the darkness. "You want to destroy Charles Bronson? You want to tell the world who I really am?" He shook his head, still chuckling with dark amusement. "Lady, you're about 30 years too late for that revelation." Harvey Lembeck found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What's he talking about?" Bronson fixed his gaze on Anna, and suddenly his expression shifted. The anguish was still there, but underneath it was something harder, Not the manufactured toughness of Hollywood, but the genuine steel of a man who'd survived truths that would break others. I never got your letters, Anna. That part's true. But not because I was running away from Charles Buczynski. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean closer. I never got them because I was in a military prison in the Pacific. For 2 years. The revelation hit like a physical impact. Anna stepped backward, her folder of evidence suddenly feeling less substantial in her hands. That's impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You were in Hollywood making movies. I saw the newspaper articles. You saw what the studio wanted you to see, what they told the papers. Bronson's laugh turned uglier. You think Hollywood gives a damn about truth? They created Charles Bronson while Charles Buczynski was rotting in a cell in Guam, charged with killing his commanding officer. Leone felt his director's mind racing. This wasn't just personal drama anymore. This was the kind of story that could destroy careers, end studios, rewrite Hollywood history. His hands trembled as he fought the urge to signal his cameraman to start rolling again. Anna's folder slipped from her fingers, photographs scattering across the desert floor like fallen leaves. You're lying. Am I? Bronson reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn wallet. From it, he extracted a yellow document, folded so many times the creases had become permanent scars. Court-martial proceedings. Charles Dennis Buczynski, private first class, accused of striking and killing Staff Sergeant William Morrison during a disciplinary action. The paper rustled in the wind as he held it up. Even Harvey Lembeck could see the military seals, the official stamps that spoke of authenticity. I was protecting a kid, Bronson continued, his voice now completely flat, drained of all emotion. 18 years old, from some farm in Nebraska. Morrison was, let's just say he had appetites that didn't involve food. His eyes found Anna's in the darkness. I hit him once, just once. But I hit him too hard and the son of a bitch fell wrong and cracked his skull. Mickey O'Brien felt the world shifting beneath his feet. 30 years in Hollywood, and he'd never suspected this. The man they'd all known as Charles Bronson, the actor everyone assumed was just playing tough guys, had actually killed someone in the service of protecting someone weaker. Self-defense, Bronson said. Protection of another serviceman. The court-martial board agreed, eventually. But it took 2 years to sort out, and by then, he gestured helplessly. By then I had nothing to come home to. Anna was shaking her head, but tears had started flowing down her cheeks. No, you could have written. You could have told me. With what? Bronson's voice cracked for the first time since his laughter had begun. A letter from military prison? Dear Anna, sorry I disappeared, but I'm locked up for killing someone? Jesus, woman, I was trying to protect you from that shame. The terrible irony settled over the assembled group like volcanic ash. Harvey Lembeck finally understood why his casual mockery had triggered such violence. The man he'd called a primitive actor wasn't acting at all. He was a genuine killer trying to build something clean from blood-stained hands. You want to destroy Charles Bronson? Bronson asked quietly. Go ahead, but understand that you'll be destroying the only good thing that ever came from Charles Buczynski's violence. In the desert darkness, surrounded by ancient stones that had witnessed countless human tragedies, two broken people finally saw each other clearly for the first time in 30 years. The photographs lay scattered across the desert floor like fallen prayers, their edges already catching sand. Anna stared at the court-martial document in Bronson's hand, her world reshaping itself around this new gravity. The silence stretched, until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. 2 years, she whispered finally. 2 years in prison while I was, her voice broke, while I was watching our children die. Bronson folded the document with careful precision, his movements mechanical. Every night in that cell I thought about coming home, thought about explaining, about making it right somehow. But by the time they released me, he gestured at the scattered photographs. What was I going to explain? That I'd been locked up for killing a man while my son was dying? That I'd failed as a father and as a human being in 2 different countries? Harvey Lembeck watched this exchange with growing horror. His casual cruelty had been predicated on simple assumptions, that Bronson was just another Hollywood tough guy, that his intensity was performance, that his past was safely buried beneath layers of manufactured persona. Now he understood he'd been poking at something genuinely dangerous, something that had survived real violence and real loss. Leone found himself thinking of the Western myths they'd been filming, stories of men remade by frontier brutality, carrying secret wounds that never fully healed. But this wasn't myth. This was the raw material from which those stories had been carved. Anna picked up one of the fallen photographs, the picture of young Michael with his father's eyes. Her hands trembled as she held it against her chest. He looked for you every day. Even when the fever got bad, he'd drag himself to the window, waiting. You think I don't know that? Bronson's composure cracked again. You think I haven't imagined it? Haven't seen his face every time I close my eyes for 30 goddamn years? He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if approaching his own past required more courage than he possessed. I became Charles Bronson because Charles Buczynski was a coward who failed everyone who mattered. Mickey O'Brien felt the weight of decades shifting around them. Hollywood was built on reinvention, on the comfortable fiction that anyone could shed their past and become someone new. But this went deeper than professional transformation. This was archaeological, layers of pain and guilt compressed into sedimentary rock. The studio knew. Bronson continued, his voice gaining momentum as if confession had its own gravity. About the court-martial, about the time in prison. They saw it as an asset, authentic toughness they could market. They helped me bury Charles Buczynski completely, gave me a new history, new stories to tell reporters. His laugh was bitter as desert alkali. Said the mystery would help my career. Said women liked dangerous men with hidden pasts. Anna's tears had stopped, replaced by something colder. While I was selling my mother's ring to pay for Michael's funeral, you were building a career on the bones of who you used to be. Yes, the admission came out like an execution. Every role, every movie, every interview where I played the strong, silent type, it was all built on running away from the night I let my son die because I was too proud and too ashamed to face what I'd done. The crew had gone completely still, understanding they were witnessing something that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the man they'd been working with. Harvey Lembeck felt particularly sick, realizing his mockery had been aimed at someone whose performance wasn't performance at all. It was survival. But you know what the real joke is? Bronson continued, and now his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. I thought killing that sergeant was the worst thing I'd ever do. Thought protecting one innocent person might balance the scales somehow. He looked directly at Anna, his eyes reflecting starlight like broken glass. I never imagined I was already a killer. Never imagined I'd murdered my own son through simple, stupid cowardice. Anna stared at him for a long moment, then slowly knelt to gather the scattered photographs. Each one seemed to carry its own weight. Michael's drawings, medical bills, the funeral receipt, images of a life that had ended while its father was locked away in a cell halfway around the world. 30 years, she said finally, standing with the pictures clutched against her chest like armor. 30 years I've been preparing to destroy you. 30 years of planning exactly how I'd make you suffer. She looked around at the crew, at Leone with his artistic eye, at Mickey with his Hollywood cynicism, at Harvey cowering in the shadows. And now I find out you've been destroying yourself all along. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the sound of distant thunder. Storm clouds were gathering over Monument Valley, blotting out the stars one by one. In the growing darkness, Charles Bronson and Anna Kowalski faced each other across 3 decades of mutual destruction, 2 people who'd built their lives around the absence of someone who'd never really existed at all. The confrontation everyone had been expecting was about to begin, but it wouldn't be the one any of them had anticipated. The first drops of rain began to fall like tears from the darkening sky, each one striking the scattered photographs with audible taps. Anna clutched the images tighter against her chest, protecting them from the coming storm, and when she looked up at Bronson again, her expression had transformed into something neither vengeful nor broken, but achingly clear. You want to know what Michael said at the very end? She asked, her voice cutting through the wind with surgical precision. When the fever finally broke his defenses and he couldn't pretend anymore, she stepped closer, close enough that Bronson could see his own reflection in her eyes. He said he forgave you. Said his daddy must be fighting the bad men, and that was more important than coming home. Bronson's face crumpled. The man who'd built a career on stoic endurance, who'd survived military prison and 30 years of self-imposed exile from his own identity, finally broke completely. His knees hit the desert sand, and the sound that escaped his throat was purely animal, the howl of a parent confronting unforgivable loss. "A 6-year-old boy," Anna continued, kneeling beside him in the dirt, her voice now gentle as rainfall, forgave what the man couldn't forgive himself. She reached out tentatively, her fingers hovering inches from his shoulder. "What does that make us, Charlie? What does that make this whole goddamn charade we've been performing for 3 decades? The crew watched in stunned silence as the woman who'd come to destroy Charles Bronson instead offered him something like absolution. Harvey Lembeck felt his chest tighten, understanding with crystalline clarity that his casual cruelty had nearly prevented this moment. This collision of truth that was somehow healing both participants, even as it devastated them. Leone found himself thinking of Pietas, of Renaissance paintings where suffering transformed into something sacred. The rain was falling harder now, turning the red desert sand into muddy streams that carried away the detritus of their shared destruction. "I can't bring them back," Bronson whispered through his tears. "Michael, the baby, the man I killed, the father you married, I can't resurrect any of it." Anna's hand finally made contact with his shoulder, the first gentle touch they'd shared in 30 years. "No, but you can stop killing them again every day." She gathered the rain-soaked photographs with her free hand, protecting them as carefully as relics. Charles Buczynski was a scared boy who made a terrible choice. Charles Bronson was the penance he paid. Maybe it's time to figure out who you actually are. Mickey O'Brien felt something shift in the air around them. Not just the storm, but the weight of decades finally settling into something bearable. The vengeance Anna had carried like a weapon for 30 years was transforming into something more complex, more forgiving. The self-hatred that had driven Bronson to exile himself from his own life was finally meeting something stronger than itself. "I don't know how," Bronson said simply. "I've been running so long I don't remember what it feels like to stand still." Anna smiled, and for a moment her face carried traces of the young woman who'd once loved Charles Buczynski enough to name their children after his family. "Then maybe you learn. Maybe we both learn." She looked around at the ancient monuments surrounding them, red stone pillars that had witnessed countless storms and still stood. Maybe that's what this place is for, teaching people how to endure. The rain was falling in earnest now, washing the desert clean. Harvey Lembeck stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away. "Charlie, He stopped, understanding that apology was insufficient for what he'd unleashed, what he'd nearly destroyed. "I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry." Bronson looked up at him and his expression held no anger, only exhaustion. "You didn't know. Nobody knew. That was the point." He struggled to his feet, Anna rising with him, and for the first time in hours he seemed to inhabit his own body fully. But maybe it's time they did. Leone felt his director's instincts stirring, recognizing the shape of resolution forming in the darkness. The storm that had been building all evening, in the sky, in the past, in the collision of secrets too long buried, was finally breaking. But instead of destruction, it was bringing the possibility of renewal. "The movie," Leone said quietly. "Tomorrow, when we finish filming—" "We finish it," Bronson said with certainty, his voice carrying new weight. "But we finish it honestly. No more performance, no more hiding behind Charles Bronson's manufactured toughness." He looked at Anna, rain streaming down both their faces. "If you're willing to help me figure out who I'm supposed to be without all the lies." Anna nodded, tears indistinguishable from rainfall. "It won't bring them back." "No," Bronson agreed. "But maybe it'll let them rest." In the desert darkness, washed clean by rain and truth, 2 broken people began the long work of learning how to stop destroying themselves. 3 months later, Charles Bronson stood in a cemetery outside Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, picked from the same hills where he'd played as Charles Buczynski 40 years earlier. The headstones were modest, working-class graves marked with simple dates and names, but they held more weight than all the monuments in Monument Valley. Anna knelt beside Michael's grave, brushing away autumn leaves with the same careful attention she'd once given to protecting his photographs from desert rain. She'd aged in the months since the confrontation, but the terrible tension that had animated her for 30 years was gone, replaced by something quieter and more sustainable. "I used to come here every Sunday," she said without looking up. "Talked to him like he could hear me, told him about school and the weather and how angry I was at his father." She placed fresh flowers on the small headstone. "Last month was the first time I came just to remember him being happy." Bronson crouched beside her, his movements still carrying traces of the careful control he'd learned in military prison. But softer now, less guarded. The weight he'd carried for decades hadn't disappeared, would never disappear, but it had shifted into something he could bear without destroying everything around him. "Once Upon a Time in the West comes out next week," he said quietly. "Leone thinks it might change everything. Says audiences have never seen anything like it." Anna smiled, the expression transforming her face into something recognizable from their youth. "Mickey sent me the final cut. You look like yourself in it. Not Charles Bronson, not Charles Buczynski trying to hide. Just yourself." She paused, watching clouds gather over the Pennsylvania hills. Michael would have been proud. The movie had indeed been finished honestly. Leone had captured something raw and unguarded in Bronson's performance, a quality that transcended acting and became something approaching truth. The critics would later call it revolutionary, a Western that showed what violence actually cost the people who carried it. But for Bronson, it had simply been the first time he'd allowed cameras to see who he really was beneath the constructed persona. "Harvey offered me 3 more pictures," Bronson said, standing slowly. "Says the studios are calling with roles I never would have been considered for before. Leading man parts, heroes instead of killers." Anna looked up at him, shading her eyes against the autumn sun. "What did you tell him?" "That Charles Bronson might be interested if the scripts were worth his time." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But Charles Buczynski has other things to do first." They walked together through the small cemetery, past graves marked with Polish and Lithuanian names, monuments to the immigrant families who'd carved lives from Pennsylvania's unforgiving landscape. Bronson had been visiting these graves for weeks now, relearning the names and stories he'd spent decades trying to forget. "I've been thinking about the house," Anna said as they reached the cemetery gates. "My mother's place is still empty. Needs work, but the bones are solid." She hesitated, then added, "There's room for someone who wanted to help fix it up. Someone who needed a place to figure out who he's supposed to be." The offer hung between them like a bridge across 30 years of mutual destruction. Not romance, that young love had died with their son, but something more complex. 2 people who'd survived the same catastrophe learning how to exist in its aftermath without destroying themselves or each other. "I don't know if I remember how to be still," Bronson admitted. "How to live somewhere without running away when it gets complicated." Anna laughed, the sound carrying traces of the girl who'd once believed in happy endings. "Then you'll learn. We both will." She touched his arm gently, the gesture now familiar after months of careful reconstruction. "Besides, someone needs to help me tell Michael's story properly, the real story, not the version I've been carrying around like a weapon." As they walked toward Anna's car, Bronson felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the possibility of a future that wasn't built on escaping the past. Hollywood would continue calling, offering him roles that traded on his newfound reputation for dangerous authenticity. But Charles Bronson was becoming less important than the man who carried that name. The Pennsylvania hills stretched around them, scarred by decades of mining but still beautiful, still capable of supporting life. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of houses where families gathered for Sunday dinner, where children grew up secure in the knowledge that their fathers would be home when darkness fell. Bronson looked back once at the cemetery where his son rested, then climbed into the passenger seat beside Anna. Tomorrow he would return to the work of building something sustainable from the ruins of Charles Buczynski's choices. But today, for the first time in 30 years, he was exactly where he belonged. The car pulled away from the cemetery, carrying 2 people who'd finally learned the difference between running from the past and learning to live with it.